Good day. My name is Chris Hintz from Savannah State University, and I'm here to share some recent work that my SSU colleagues, Sean Rosenquist, who is also a principal at Cuttybum Hydrology, and our graduate student Summer Wright conducted as part of our research funded by the 2020-2022 Georgia Sea Grant. Fundamentally, the Sea Grant research is to expand development of a few techniques that Sean and I initially worked on as part of some rapid funding Georgia Sea Grant made available after Hurricane Irma impacted the coastline in 2017. Our current graduate student on the project, Summer Wright, is presenting a detailed description of our complementary techniques in another presentation titled A Review of the Methodology for Identifying Head of Tide in Upland Rivers using Fourier and Wavelet Analyses. The specific goals of the current research, short term, are to determine the current head of tide in the 5 Georgia upland rivers, Savannah, Ogeechee, Altamaha, Satilla, and St. Mary's. By doing so, though, we hope to identify areas critical to emergency management and preparedness, regions of protected habitat, improve our baseline data set for monitoring sea level rise from climate change or coastal development, for example, the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project. Lastly, in our early study, we documented significant movement of the head of tide due to upland flooding, and our current research is diving deep into these impacts so that we can better understand the hydrological interactions of upland flooding and coastal estuarine tidal flow. This all leads to the long-term goal of improving coastal resiliency by understanding the impacts of stochastic events like river flooding or storm surge act on top of the normal effects like downstream river flow interacting with our strong semi-diurnal tides in coastal Georgia. As with all of us, the COVID pandemic severely restricted efforts to conduct research during the first half of 2020. This led to our team searching for ways to address our research goals while in quarantine. Thus, we began to investigate the long-term data series already available in our study basins. Specifically, as part of our Sea Grant work in the Altamaha River, we initially looked at USGS River Gage near Everett City, located at River Mile 30. This landing at Altamaha Park is regular, yearly flooding driven by the wintertime rainfall coming into a drainage basin that covers 1/4 of the state of Georgia. However, for much of the year, there is strong semi-diurnal tidal influence at the site, despite the very strong river-dominated Altamaha estuary. So we wanted to apply our Wavelet and Fourier techniques to help inform us how and when head of tide was moving across this long-term river gauge. However, we knew that most sites did not have this regular occurrence associated with head of tide across the sensor location. Further, the discharge at tidal location provides little predictive information. So we captured the river flow in the upstream non-tidal USGS river gauge and looked to categorize the downstream flow as tidal or non-tidal. So the upstream non-tidal data set is shown on top, in this case the Altamaha River at Doctortown, Georgia at River Mile 65. The Altamaha's flood stages defined by the Doctortown gauge help inform how to investigate the data downstream at the tidal Everett City River gauge, accounting for an approximate 48-hour lag in floodwaters moving between Doctortown and Everett City, estimated by measuring the time difference among approximately half-dozen flood stage peaks collected from all flood stages. The lower graph at Everett City River gauge is highlighted based on Doctortown flood stage that flowed downriver. One thing to notice is that in this case, the Altamaha minor flooding upstream sometimes causes moderate flooding downstream. So each of these river systems and perhaps each river gauge must be analyzed individually to fully appreciate the complexities of these river systems. We did this initial assessment for upstream reference gauge flooding at all 5 Georgia rivers and compared them to downstream river stages impacted by semi-diurnal tidal flow. Shown here is a representative data set from the Savannah River upstream at Clio, Georgia at River Mile 61 and downstream at Hardyville at River Mile 39. For all data sets, we went back 10 years except for the St. Mary's, where the data were only available for, say, the past 6 years. All rivers except the Satilla had gauges in the 60 river mile section upstream and in the 20 to 30 river mile section downstream. Here's a representative analysis for the Everett City River gauge on the Altamaha. We noted previously the semi-diurnal river gauge pattern during normal flow. Fourier analysis of all the data on the Altamaha River gave strong indication that there is a regular tide here by identifying several semi-diurnal and diurnal tidal harmonics at the Everett City River gauge. This clearly establishes normal head of tide upstream from this river gauge at River Mile 30. However, if you analyze downstream river gauge data when upstream Doctortown River gauge is at action stage or higher, the Fourier tidal signals are suppressed. This is also true if you bound the data to a single flooding stage like action or minor flooding, and not analyze the cumulative river gauge data at each flood stage and higher. Although Fourier analysis relies on large data sets for the analytical power, the regular yearly flooding at Everett City provided many months of data to analyze over the 10-year data set. Thus, it seems unlikely that the head of tide remains above Everett City during the yearly flooding event, and we are observing a real lack of tidal signal in this downstream river gauge. Now, this is a bit deceptive in that we can see, focusing in on very short periods of the river gauge data, particularly during receding floods, the tidal signal rebounds, but these data do not occur often enough to identify the tidal influence with Fourier analysis. To help our understanding of short-term effects, we investigating the impact of upstream flooding using 12-hour moving average method that was discussed in Summer's presentation, so I won't elaborate too much here. Briefly though, the top time series is again the USGS river gauge at Everett City at river mile 30 on the Altamaha River. All river data are used in the first moving average analysis, and the yellow highlight shows river gauge heights exceeding the 0.2 foot tide around the 12-hour moving mean, measured in the river gauge data, indicating the likely presence of semi-diurnal tidal influence. In the lower right, the blue histogram of these identified tidal data compared to all data in the gray histogram at different river stage. The blue percentages are cumulative tidal observations, ultimately totaling 62% of the time here at Everett City. This suggests that the head of tide is more likely upstream from this location, but the black percentages are the percent tidal observations at individual 1-foot river stage bends. You can see that the tide is identified more than 50% of the time at Everett City when the Everett City gauge is below 9 foot, but not identified very often at the river stage increases above 9 feet. As we turn our focus again on analyzing data only when the upstream river gauge was flooding, the original normal stage in black is omitted from analysis, and only light blue flood stages are used to identify tidal occurrences. The head of tide is less frequently identified above Everett City, only about 3% of the time, less than what we would consider a regular tidal influence. Interestingly though, the tide was identified at Everett City at similar local river stages between 8 and 9 feet, suggesting that while upstream flow is primary component and we might be able to use local river gauge as an indicator of head of tide location. Thus, we may be able to develop an estimated head of tide location without a priori knowledge of upstream flow. Lastly, wavelet analysis can estimate the amplitude and wavelength of each individual stage altering event in the river, and then enumerate them to describe behavior of stage at that location. This gives insight into frequency and the amplitude of the complex river gauge data. The 12-hour portion of the data is matched and plotted against upstream river stage to illustrate the sensitivity of local tidal range to upstream river stage, something that we've not done with other methods. This information allows us to make inferences about the interaction of upstream stage with tide and potentially provides more information regarding head of tide migration in the vicinity of the downstream river gauge. Further, the slope of this interaction, how much tidal range is reduced at elevated upstream stage, yields insight in the upstream system and hydrological interactions between opposing river flows. So, broadening our analyses across the 5 upland river systems in Georgia, we will start with the Savannah River. That is our best instrumented and understood river. However, also the river most heavily influenced by man, both in flood control and channel manipulation. Previously, we identified the normal head of tide near Ebenezer Landing at river mile 45, but also noted that the head of tide migrated downstream below river mile 39 with upland flooding. From our analyses of long-term USGS gauge data, it is clear that the head of tide migration quickly moves from river mile 45 down to below river mile 39, nearly as soon as the river floods. All 3 analyses come to the same conclusion, giving a lot of confidence in this finding. Further, these analyses indicate that the head of tide does not move much farther downstream, certainly not below Port Wentworth at the I-95 bridge during flooding events. Our current deployment of temporary tide gauge sensors should capture this head of tide migration during the flooding events occurring right now in the February 2021. Turning to the Altamaha, while this river is less instrumented than the Savannah, we are fortunate that the river gauge at Everett City already experiences the transition of head of tide during flooding events. and all analyses indicate that the normal head of tide is above this site, but quickly migrates below river mile 30 during upstream flooding events. Interestingly, though, the Wavelet Analysis gives indication that the head of tide will not move far below Everett City during flooding, but we need additional information to elucidate this observation. We have instrumented the region, and again, the flooding events of winter 2021 look to capture the head of tide migration well through the river system, so we can test this hypothesis later this year. We also need to continue this work using 2 LTER sites downstream from our study area at river mile 19 and 16 that may also yield interesting results on upland river flow interacting with the semi-diurnal tide in the upper reaches of this river-dominated estuary. In the summer of 2021, we plan to begin deploying temporary tide gauges in the St. Mary's River. As with the Altamaha, we are fortunate that USGS Gage at Folkestone observes the head of tide migration, so we have a location to focus on our instrument efforts. One thing to note about this river system is the head of tide travels about 50% farther upstream than any of the other basins we've studied so far. We need to investigate some of the influences with elevation, river meander bathymetry, and coastal development that likely contribute to this observation. While all the analyses confirm that the normal head of tide is above the river gauge at Folkestone, they disagree slightly when the head of tide will migrate past this location at river mile 60. So we will need to add sensors upstream and downstream of the USGS gauge to gather the necessary data to understand head of tide migration. The St. Mary's presents a challenge in that the upstream gauge at McClenny, Florida is much farther away from our region where head of tide is migrating. We cannot immediately identify what impact that may have on the precision of migration predictions using flooding identified so far upstream. Additionally, there are tidbits of information we need to explore more closely to the 2017 Hurricane Irma storm surge and the impacts after the storm as floodwaters pass through these regions. Our current analyses focused on the upland floodwaters coming downstream, and we must adapt our analyses to look at storm surge pushing inland ahead of the flooding from tropical rainfall. This line of research has been good to identify potential data sets that we need to subsample and focus our analytical methods on in the future. Lastly, there's an unusual 3 to 4 month period in 2017 starting in June, well before Hurricane Irma, and lasting 6 weeks after Irma's impacts, where the tidal range is notably smaller than all other time during the 10-year data set. Now, the 2 upper USGS stations on the Ogeechee do not give strong evidence of the head of tide migrating across their locations. Neither Eden nor Elabel indicated regular tidal influence. While Fourier identified a diurnal influence related to the solar day instead of the sidereal day, no other semi-diurnal harmonics were identified, and it would appear that the diurnal influence is not tidal, but we must investigate this further. Alternatively, the Richmond Hill River gauge is tidal at most flow conditions. While the analyses have slightly different conclusions, there are not much data in our 10-year data set for stages higher than minor flooding, so these conclusions could be limited in this case. The current winter 2021 flooding on the Ogeechee is higher than any modern data we analyzed here and has not been observed since the late 90s. One interesting nugget coming from the Wavelet analysis was the small changes in upstream gauge caused large changes in tidal amplitude, nearly double or quadruple the effect of our other systems. We tentatively hypothesize that the closer upstream gauge in Eden makes downstream gauges more sensitive to respond to rainfall inundation. It is clear that the region we instrumented below Elabel at river mile 54 and above Richmond Hill river mile 37 is where the head of tide is located in this river. So we are poised to evaluate a 20 to 50 year flood event that our temporary sensor network should yield improved information from flood response in this region. Lastly, the Satilla will be the real challenge in the upcoming year. There are so few USGS gauges on the river, it is unclear where the head of tide currently resides along its nearly 70-mile stretch between Woodbine and Atkinson. Further, we identified hurricane impacts that we'll have to go back and additionally investigate, but the lack of river gauges in the region may limit those efforts. So in conclusion, the methods we employed during the analysis of long-term data sets available in our Georgia river systems provide good agreement on where and when the head of tide migrates through different regions of the river basins. But we have to use these approaches in concert as they have unique strengths and weaknesses. The much larger problem continues to be the legal definition of head of tide at 0.2 foot tidal height. For example, how often must this occur and how is that tidal height officially measured? We employ multiple methods of identifying head of tide that are related to this formal definition. However, there are nuances to each technique we use. Particularly, we currently agree head of tide is present when identifying the tide greater than 50% of the time, or that we use a statistical test to identify the tidal harmonic in a Fourier analysis. Anecdotally, we've heard field personnel use other indicators. All of these move away from the legal definition and into different levels of ambiguity or are subject to interpretation. But this research has provided us better understanding of the current river gauge resources, the information that they provide, how to best use them when our current sea grant funding ends and we can no longer support temporary tide gauges. To date, our analyses all support our deployment strategies and give us a great deal of confidence that we will collect excellent data series to positively identify where the head of tide exists and regularly migrates in our 5 Georgia upland river systems. Further analyses of historic data and those of our temporary tide gauges will potentially provide insight in understanding the critical components driving head of tide migration during stochastic events. We may be able to develop new ways of employing long-term assets in the region in conjunction with our short-term deployments to produce critical knowledge in the individual systems that is valuable in modeling their response during all river stages in the future. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to discussing this in the Q&A in a few weeks.